The emperor usually remained in his cabin during the whole morning. So excessive was the heat that he only wore a very slight dress. He could not sleep and frequently rose in the night. Reading was his chief occupation. I was sent for almost every morning and translated from the Encyclopedia Britannica and such other books as were on board, whatever they contained relative to St. Helena or the countries near which we were sailing. This led to my historical atlas being brought under review. Napoleon had merely glanced at it on board the Bellerophon, and before that time he had but a very indistinct notion of the work. I now had the satisfaction of seeing it in the emperor's hands for several days, and of hearing him express the warmest approbation of my labors. The quantity and arrangement of the matter seemed more particularly to please him. He had, in fact, hitherto been but little acquainted with the book, passing over all the others. His chief attention was attracted by the geographical charts, more especially the map of the world, which seemed principally to excite his notice and applause. I did not attempt to convince him that the geography was the weakest part of the work, displaying far less labor and research than other parts. The general tables could not easily be surpassed, either as to their method, symmetry, or facility for use, while each of the genealogical tables presented a miniature history of the country they concerned, and of which they were, in all respects, both a complete analysis and a collection of elementary materials. The emperor asked me whether the work had been used in all our systems of education, adding that, had it been better known to him, all the schools and lyceums would have been furnished with it. He further asked why I had published it under the borrowed name of Le Sage. I replied that a very imperfect sketch had been published in England just after my emigration, at a time when we could not acknowledge our names as emigrants abroad without danger to our relations in France. And perhaps, said I, laughing, it was not then cured of the prejudices of my youth, like the nobles of Britannia, who deposited their swords in the registrar of the civil court while engaged in trade, that they might not derogate from their family dignity. As already observed, the emperor always rose from table long before the rest of the company. The grand marshal and I always followed him to the quarter-deck, where I was frequently left alone with him, as General Bertrand had often to attend his wife, who suffered excessively from seasickness. After the preliminary remarks on the weather, the ship's progress, and the winds, Napoleon used to start a subject of conversation or revive that of the preceding or some other former day. And when he had taken 8 or 9 turns the whole length of the deck, he would seat himself on the second gun from the gangway on the larboard side. The midshipmen soon observed this habitual predilection, so that the cannon was thenceforth called the Emperor's gun. It was there that Napoleon often conversed for hours together, and that I learned for the first time a part of what I am about to relate, in doing which I wish to observe that I shall at the same time add whatever I collected in a variety of subsequent conversations, thus presenting at one view all that I have heard worth noting on the subject. That is, perhaps, the proper place to repeat once for all that if little order or method be found in my journal, it arises from the manner in which I am pressed for time. My contemporaries expect the work, and the state of my health precludes all application. Thus situated, I am fearful of not having time to finish it. Such are my excuses, unfortunately too valid. Such are my claims to indulgence. As to the style and arrangement of my facts, what was set down at the moment is here hastily reproduced nearly in the same state as when first committed to paper. The name of Bonaparte may be spelt either Bonaparte or Buonaparte, as the Italians know. Napoleon's father always introduced the you, and his uncle, the Archdeacon Lucien, who survived Napoleon's father and was a parent to Napoleon and his brothers, at the same time and under the same roof, wrote it Bonaparte. During his youth, Napoleon followed the example of his father. On attaining the command of the army of Italy, he took good care not to alter the orthography, which agreed with the spirit of the language. But at a later period, when amongst the French, he wished to adopt their orthography, and thenceforward wrote his name as Bonaparte. This family for many years made a distinguished figure in the Bolognese territory. It was very powerful in Treviso and is to be found inscribed on the Golden Book of Bologna, as also amongst the patricians of Florence. When Napoleon, as general-in-chief of the army of Italy, entered Treviso at the head of his victorious army, the principal inhabitants came to meet him, bringing title deeds and records, which proved that his family had once been one of the most eminent of their city. At the interview of Dresden, before the Russian campaign, the Emperor Francis one day told Napoleon, then his son-in-law, that his family had governed as sovereigns at Treviso, a fact of which there could be no doubt, as Francis had caused all the documents proving it to be drawn up and presented to him. Napoleon replied with a smile that he did not wish to know anything about it, and that he preferred being Rodolphe of Habsburg of his own family. Francis attached much more importance to the matter. He said that it was of very little consequence to have fallen from wealth to poverty, but that it was above all price to have been of sovereign rank, and that the fact must be communicated to Maria Louisa, to whom it would afford infinite pleasure. When during the campaign of Italy, Napoleon entered Bologna, Marescal di Caprara and Aldini, since so well known in France and at that time deputies in the Senate of their native city, came of their own accord to present the Golden Book, in which the name and arms of his ancestors were inscribed. There are several houses at Florence which attest the former existence of the Bonaparte family there. Many houses are even still seen bearing the escutcheons of the family. Cesare, a Corsican or Bolognese residing in London, who was shocked at the manner in which the British government had received Napoleon's pacific letter on assuming the consulate, published a genealogical notice wherein he established the emperor's alliance with the ancient house of Este, Wolf, or Gulf, supposed to be the parent stem of the present royal family of England. The Duc de Feltre, a French ambassador in Tuscany, brought to Paris from the Gallery de Medici the portrait of the Bonaparte who had married a princess of the Grand Duke's family, the mother of Pope Nicholas V, or Paul V of Sarzana, was also a Bonaparte. It was also a Bonaparte who negotiated the treaty by which Leghorn was exchanged for Sarzana. It is a Bonaparte that we are indebted for one of the oldest comedies written at the period of the revival of letters, entitled The Widow. It may be seen in the Royal Library at Paris. When Napoleon marched against Rome at the head of the French army and received the propositions of the Pope at Tolentino, one of the negotiators of the enemy observed that he was the only Frenchman who had marched against Rome since the Constable de Bourbon. But what rendered this circumstance still more singular was that the history of the first expedition was written by an ancestor of him who executed the second. That is to say, Signor Niccolo Bonaparte, who has in reality left us a work called The Sacking of Rome by the Constable de Bourbon. Hence, perhaps, or from the Pope mentioned above, the name of Niccolo, which the writer of certain pamphlets pretended to be that of the emperor instead of Napoleon. This work is to be found in most libraries. It is preceded by a history of the House of Bonaparte, printed about 40 or 50 years ago and edited by Dr. Vecchia, a professor of Pisa. Mr. De Seto, ambassador of Bavaria, has often told me that the archives of Munich contain a great number of documents in Italian, which prove the antiquity and importance of the Bonaparte family. During the continuance of his power, Napoleon always refused to take any pains or even enter into conversation on the subject. The first attempt to excite his attention to this matter occurred in the time of his consulate and was so much discouraged that no one ever attempted to renew the discussion. Someone published a genealogy in which it was contrived to connect the family of Napoleon with certain northern kings. Napoleon caused this specimen of flattery to be ridiculed in the public papers, in which the writers concluded by observing that the nobility of the first consul only dated from Montenotte, or from the 18th of Brumaire. This family suffered, like many others, from the numerous revolutions which desolated the cities of Italy. The travels of Florence placed the Bonapartes among the fuoriusciti, or emigrants. One of the family retired to Sarzana in the first instance, and thus went to Corsica, from which island his descendants always continued to send their children to Tuscany, where they were educated under the care of the branch that remained in San Miniato. The second son to this branch had borne the name of Napoleon for several generations, which was derived from an ancestor thus named, celebrated in the annals of Italy. When on his way to Florence after the expedition to Leghorn, Napoleon slept at the house of an old Abbé Bonaparte at San Miniato, who treated the whole of his staff with great magnificence. Having exhausted all the family recollections, the Abbé told the young general that he was going to bring forth the most precious document of all. Napoleon thought he was about to show him a fine genealogical tree well calculated to gratify his vanity, said he, laughing. But it was a memorial regularly drawn up in favor of Father Bonaventura Bonaparte, a Capuchin friar of Bologna, long since beatified, who had not yet been canonized, owing to the enormous expense it required. The Pope will not refuse you, said the good Abbé, if you ask him, and should it be necessary to pay the sum now, it will be a mere trifle for you. Napoleon laughed heartily at this simplicity, so little in harmony with the manners of the day. The old man never dreamt that the saints were no longer in fashion. On reaching Florence, Napoleon conceived it would be very satisfactory to his namesake to send him the ribbon of the Order of St. Stephen, of which he was merely a knight, but the pious Abbé was much less anxious about the favors of this world than the religious justice which he so pertinaciously claimed, and as it afterwards appeared, not without reason, the Pope, when he came to Paris to crown the Emperor, also recurred to the claims of Father Bonaventura. It was doubtless he, said the Pope, who from his seat among the blessed had led his relative, as it were, by the hand through the glorious earthly career he had traversed, and who had preserved Napoleon in the midst of so many dangers and battles. The Emperor, however, always turned a deaf ear to these remarks, leaving it to the Holy Father's own discretion to provide for the glory of Bonaventura. As to the old Abbé of San Miniato, he left his fortune to Napoleon, who presented it to one of the public establishments of Tuscany. It would, however, be very difficult to connect any genealogical data in this place from the conversations of the Emperor, who used often to say he had never looked at one of his parchments, these having always remained in the hands of his brother Joseph, whom he styled the genealogist of the family. And lest I may forget it, I will here mention the fact of Napoleon's having, when on the point of embarking, delivered a packet to his brother containing all the original letters addressed to him by the sovereigns of Europe in their own handwriting. I frequently expressed my regret to the Emperor at his parting with such a precious historical manuscript. Charles Bonaparte, the father of Napoleon, was extremely tall, handsome, and well-made. His education had been well conducted at Rome and Pisa, where he studied the law. He is said to have possessed great spirit and energy. It was he who, on its being proposed to submit to France in the public assembly of Corsica, delivered a speech which electrified the whole country. He was not more than 20 years of age at this period. If it only depended on the will to become free, said he, all nations would be so. Yet history teaches us that very few have attained the blessings of liberty, because few have energy, courage, and virtue enough to deserve them. When the island was conquered, he wished to accompany Paoli in his emigration, but an old uncle, the Archdeacon Lucien, who exercised the authority of a parent over him, prevented his departure. In 1779, Charles Bonaparte was elected deputy to represent the nobles of Corsica at Paris, where he brought young Napoleon with him, then only 10 years old. He passed through Florence on his way and obtained a letter of introduction from the Grand Duke Leopold to his sister, the Queen of France. It was to his known rank and the respectability of his name and family in Tuscany that he was indebted for this mark of attention. There were 2 French generals in Corsica at the above period, so inimical to each other that their quarrels formed 2 parties. One was Monsieur de Marbeuf, a mild and popular character, and the other Monsieur de Narbonne-Pellier, distinguished for haughtiness and violence. The latter, from his birth and superior interest, must have been a dangerous man for his rival. Fortunately for Monsieur de Marbeuf, he was much more beloved in the island. When a deputation headed by Charles Bonaparte arrived at Versailles, he was consulted on the dispute, and the warmth of his testimony obtained a triumph for Marbeuf. The Archbishop of Lyon, nephew to Marbeuf, thought it his duty to wait on the deputy and thank him for the services he had rendered. On young Napoleon's being placed in the military school of Brienne, the Archbishop gave him a special recommendation to the family of Brienne, which lived there during the greater part of the year, hence the friendly demeanor of the Marbeufs and Briennes toward the children of the Bonaparte family. Calumny has assigned another cause, but the simple examination of dates is fully sufficient to prove its absurdity. Old Mr. de Marbeuf, who commanded in Corsica, lived at Ajaccio, where the family of Charles Bonaparte was one of the principal. Madame Bonaparte being the most fascinating and beautiful woman in the town, it was very natural for the general to frequent her house in preference to many other places of resort. Charles Bonaparte died at the age of 38 of an induration of the glands of the stomach. He had experienced a temporary cure during one of his visits to Paris, but became the victim of a second attack at Montpellier, where he was interned in one of the convents of the city. During the consulate, the notables of Montpellier, through the medium of their countryman Chaptal, Minister of the Interior, solicited the permission of the first consul to erect a monument to the memory of his father. Napoleon thanked them for their good intentions, but declined acceding to their solicitation. "Let us not disturb the repose of the dead," said he. "Let their ashes remain in peace. I have also lost my grandfather and grandfather. Why not erect monuments to them? This might lead too far. Had my father died yesterday, it would be proper and natural that my grief should be accompanied by some signal mark of respect. But his death took place 20 years ago. It is an event of no public interest, and it is useless to revive the recollection of it." At a subsequent period, Louis Bonaparte, without the knowledge of Napoleon, had his father's remains disinterred and removed to Saint-Leu, where he erected a monument to his memory. Charles Bonaparte had been the very reverse of devout. He had even written some anti-religious poems, and yet at the period of his death, said the emperor, there were not priests enough for him in Montpellier. In this respect, he was very different from his brother Archdeacon Lucien, a very pious and orthodox ecclesiastic who died long after him at a very advanced age. On his deathbed, he took great umbrage at Fesch, who, being by this time a priest, ran to him in his stole and surplice to assist him in his last moments. Lucien begged that he would suffer him to die in peace, and he breathed his last surrounded by the members of his family, giving them philosophical counsel and patriarchal benedictions. The emperor frequently spoke of his old uncle, who had been a second father to him, and who was for a length of time the head of the family. He was Archdeacon of Ajaccio, one of the principal dignitaries of the island. His prudence and economy reestablished the affairs of the family, which had been much deranged by the extravagance of Charles. The old uncle was much revered and enjoyed considerable authority in the district. The peasantry voluntarily submitted their disputes to his decision, and he frequently gave them his advice and his blessing. Charles Bonaparte married Mademoiselle Laetitia Ramolini, whose mother, after the death of her first husband, married Captain Fesch, an officer in one of the Swiss regiments, which the Genoese usually maintained on the island. Cardinal Fesch was the issue of this second marriage, and was consequently stepbrother to Madame and uncle to the emperor. Madame was one of the most beautiful women of her day, and she was celebrated throughout Corsica. Paoli, in the time of his power, having received an embassy from Algiers or Tunis, wished to give the Barbary envoy some notion of the attractions of the island, and for this purpose he assembled together all the most beautiful women in Corsica, amongst whom Madame took the lead. Subsequently, when she traveled to Brienne to see her son, her personal charms were remarked even in Paris. During the war for Corsican liberty, Madame Bonaparte shared the dangers of her husband, who was an enthusiast of the cause. In his different expeditions, she frequently followed him on horseback while she was pregnant with Napoleon. She was a woman of extraordinary vigor of mind, joined to considerable pride and loftiness of spirit. She was the mother of 13 children, and she might have had many more, for she was a widow at the age of 30. Of these 13 children, only 5 boys and 3 girls lived, all of whom played distinguished parts in the reign of Napoleon. Joseph, the eldest of the family, was originally intended for the church on account of the influence possessed by Marbeuf, Archbishop of Lyon, who had the patronage of numerous livings. He went through the regular course of study, but when the moment arrived for taking orders, he refused to enter the ecclesiastical profession. He was successfully King of Naples and Spain. Louis was King of Holland, and Jerome King of Westphalia. Eliza was Grand Duchess of Tuscany, Caroline Queen of Naples, and Pauline Princess Borghese. Lucien, who through his marriage and a mistaken direction of character doubtless forfeited a crown, atoned for all his past errors by throwing himself into the arms of the emperor on his return from Elba at a moment when Napoleon was far from relying on the certainty of his prospects. Lucien, the emperor, used to say, passed a turbulent career in his youth. At the age of 15, he was taken to France by Monsieur Simonville, who soon made him a zealous revolutionist and an ardent clubbist. On this subject, the emperor said that in the numerous libels published against him were some addresses of letters bearing, among other signatures, that of Brunus Bonaparte, which were attributed to him. Napoleon, he would not affirm, he said, that these addresses were not written by some individual in the family, but he could declare that they were not his production. I had the opportunity of rendering myself acquainted with the sentiments of Prince Lucien on the emperor's return from Elba, and am enabled to say that it would have been difficult for any man to have been more upright and steady in his political views, or to have evinced greater devotedness and goodwill towards his brother. The 22nd through the 26th. On the 22nd, we came within sight of Madeira, and at night arrived off the port. Only 2 of the vessels cast anchor to take on board supplies for the squadron. The wind blew very hard, and the sea was exceedingly rough. The emperor found himself indisposed, and I was also ill. A sudden gale arose. The air was excessively hot and seemed to be impregnated with small particles of sand. We were now assailed by the emanations of the terrible winds from the deserts of Africa. This weather lasted throughout the whole of the following day. Our communication with the shore became extremely difficult. The English consul came on board and informed us that for many years there had not been such a hurricane at Madeira. The vintage was entirely destroyed. All the windows in the towns were broken, and it had been found scarcely possible to breathe in the streets. All this time we continued tracking about before the town, which we continued to do throughout the whole of the following night. And on the 24th, when we took on board several oxen and stores of other provisions, such as unripe oranges, bad peaches, and tasteless pears, the figs and grapes were, however, excellent. In the evening, we made way with great rapidity, the wind still blowing hard. On the 25th, 26th, we lay to during a portion of the day to distribute provisions among the vessels composing the squadron. During the rest of the time, we sailed on smoothly and rapidly. Meanwhile, nothing occurred to interrupt the uniformity of the scene. Each day crept slowly on and added to the past interval, which as a whole seemed brief because it was void of interest and not characterized by any remarkable incident. The emperor had added to the number of his amusements by a game at piquet, which he regularly played around 3 o'clock. This was succeeded by a few games at chess with the Grand Marshal, Monsieur de Montallon, or some other individual until dinner time. There was no very good chess player on board the vessel. The Emperor was but an indifferent player. He gained with some, lost with others, a circumstance which one evening led him to say, "How happens it that I frequently lose with those who are never able to beat him, whom I almost always beat? Does not this seem contradictory? How is this problem to be solved?" said he, winking his eye, to show that he was not the dupe of the constant politeness of him who was really the best player. "We no longer played at Vatillon in the evening. We gave up this game on account of our having played too high," at which the Emperor appeared displeased, for he was a great enemy to gaming. On returning from his afternoon walk on the deck, Napoleon played 2 or 3 games of chess and retired to rest early. 27th through the 31st, at daybreak on Sunday, the 27th, we found ourselves among the Canaries, which we passed in the course of the day, sailing at the rate of 10 or 12 knots an hour, without having perceived the famous Peak of Tenerife, a circumstance the more extraordinary, since in clear weather it is visible at the distance of 60 leagues. On the 26th, we crossed the tropic and observed many flying fish round this ship. On the 31st, at 11 at night, one of the sailors threw himself overboard. He was a Negro who had got drunk and was fearful of the flogging that awaited him. He had several times in the course of the evening attempted to jump overboard, and at last succeeded. He, however, soon repeated and uttered loud cries. He swam very well, but though the boat was immediately sent off and every endeavor used to rescue him, he was lost. The cries of this man in the sea excited a powerful sensation on board the vessel. In a moment the crew were hurrying about in every direction. The noise was very great and the agitation universal. As I was descending from deck to the cabin, a midshipman, a youth between 10 and 12 years of age, of an interesting countenance, thinking I was going to inform the Emperor of what had occurred, seized hold of my coat, and in a tone expressive of the tenderest interest exclaimed, "Ah, sir, do not alarm him. Tell him the noise is nothing at all, that it's only a man fallen overboard." Amiable and innocent youth! He expressed his sentiments rather than his thoughts. In general, the midshipmen, of whom there were several on board the ship, behaved with marked respect and attention to the Emperor. They every evening repeated a scene that made a deep impression on our feelings. Early in the morning, the sailors carried up their hammocks and put them in the large nettings at the side of the ship, and about 6 in the evening they carried them away at the signal of a whistle. Those who were tardy in the performance of this duty received a certain punishment. On the signal being given, a great bustle ensued, and it was gratifying to see the midshipmen at this moment form a circle round the Emperor. Whether he might be standing in the middle of the deck or resting on his favorite gun, they watched his motions with an anxious eye, and either by signs or words directed the sailors to avoid incommoding him. The Emperor frequently observed his conduct and remarked that youthful hearts were always inclined to enthusiasm. I will now proceed with the details which I collected at various times respecting the early years of the Emperor's life. Napoleon was born about noon on the 15th of August, the Assumption Day, in the year of 1769. His mother, who was possessed of great bodily as well as mental vigor, who had braved the dangers of war during her pregnancy, wished to attend Mass on account of the solemnity of the day. She was, however, taken ill at church, and on her return home was delivered before she could be conveyed to her chamber. The child, as soon as it was born, was laid on the carpet, which was an old-fashioned one, representing at full length the heroes of fable, or perhaps the Iliad. This child was Napoleon. In his boyhood, Napoleon was turbulent, adroit, lively, and agile in the extreme. He had gained, he used to say, the most complete ascendancy over his eldest brother, Joseph. The latter was beaten and ill-treated. Complaints were carried to the mother, and she would begin to scold before Joseph had even time to open his mouth. At the age of 10, Napoleon was sent to the military school at Brienne. His name, which in Corsican accent be pronounced as if it were Napoleoni, from the similarity of the sound, procured for him amongst his youthful companions the nickname of La poione, straw in his nose. At this period, a great change took place in Napoleon's character. In contradiction to all the apocryphal histories which contain anecdotes of his life when he was at Brienne, really mild, quite as susceptible. One day, the quartermaster, who was a man of harsh disposition and who never took the trouble of considering the physical and moral shades of character in each individual scholar, condemned Napoleon by way of punishment to wear the serge coat and to take his dinner on his knees at the door of the refectory. Napoleon, who had a vast share of pride and self-conceit, was so mortified by this disgrace that he was seized with a violent retching and suffered a severe nervous attack. The headmaster of the school, happening accidentally to pass by, relieved him of the punishment, reproving the quartermaster for his want of discernment. And Father Patral, professor of mathematics, was very indignant on finding that his first mathematician had been treated with so little respect. On attaining the age of puberty, Napoleon's temper became morose and reserved. His passion for reading was carried to excess, and he eagerly devoured the contents of every book that fell in his way. Pichegru was at this time his quartermaster and his tutor in the 4 rules of arithmetic. Pichegru was a native of Franche-Comté, where his family were farmers. The minimum monks of Champagne were appointed to superintend the military school of Brienne. Owing to their poverty, however, so few individuals were induced to enter their order that they found themselves inadequate to the task imposed on them, and they solicited the assistance of the minimum monks of the Franche-Comté, of whom Father Patral was one. An aunt of Pichegru, a nun of La Charité, followed Patral for the purpose of superintending the infirmary, and she was accompanied by her nephew, a youth who was admitted to the school to receive his education gratuitously. Pichegru, who was extremely clever, was on his attaining a suitable age made quartermaster and tutor under Father Patral, who had taught him mathematics. He intended to become a monk, which was the sole object of his ambition and of his aunt's wishes. But Father Patral dissuaded him from this idea, assuring him that the profession was not suited to the age and that he ought to look forward to something better. He prevailed on him to enlist in the artillery, where the revolution found him sub-officer. His military career is known. He was the conqueror of Holland. Thus, Father Patral had the honor of counting among his pupils the 2 greatest generals of modern France. Father Patral was subsequently secularized by Monsieur de Brienne, Archbishop of Sens, and Cardinal de Lomenie, who made him one of his grand vicars and entrusted him with the management of his numerous benefices. At the time of the Revolution, Father Patral, though his opinions were widely opposite to those of his patron, nevertheless exerted every endeavor to save him, and with this view applied to Danton, who was a native of the same part of France to which the cardinal and himself belonged, but all was unavailing, and it is supposed that Patral, after the manner of the ancients, rendered to the cardinal the service of procuring for him a poisoned draught to save him from the scaffold. Madame de Lomenie, the cardinal's niece, before her life was sacrificed by the revolutionary tribunal, entrusted Father Patral with the care of her 2 daughters, who were yet in their childhood. The moment of terror having passed away, their aunt, Madame de Brienne, who had escaped the storm and preserved a considerable portion of her fortune, applied to Father Patral for the children. But he refused to give them up on the ground that their mother would have directed him to withdraw them from their world and to devote them to the occupation of peasants. He had conceived a design of literally executing these figurative commands and was on the point of uniting them to 2 of his own nephews. I was then, said Napoleon, General of the Army of the Interior, and I became the mediator for the restoration of the 2 children, an object which was not accomplished without difficulty. Patral employed every possible means of resistance. These daughters of Madame de Lomenie were the 2 ladies whom you have since known by the names of Madame de Marnizia and the beautiful Madame de Canissi, Duchess of Vicenza. Father Patral, having renewed his acquaintance with his own old pupil, followed him and joined the army of Italy, where he proved himself better able to calculate projectiles than to meet their effects. At Montenotte, Millesimo, and Dago, he evinced the most puerile cowardice. During the action, he was occupied, not like Moses in praying, but in weeping. The general-in-chief appointed him administrator of domains at Milan, for which he derived considerable profits. On Napoleon's return from Egypt, he presented himself to him. He was no longer the little Minna-monk of Champagne, but a corpulent financier possessed of upwards of 1,000,000. 2 years afterwards, he again sought an interview with the first consul at Malmaison. He now looked mean, dejected, and shabbily dressed. "How is this?" inquired the consul. "You see before you a ruined man," replied Patron. "One who is reduced to beggary, the victim of severe misfortune." The first consul determined to investigate the truth of this statement. He discovered that Father Patron had commenced the trade of a usurer. The great calculator had lost his fortune through bankruptcies in lending at great risk for a high interest. "I've already paid my debt," said the first consul at his next interview with him. "I can do no more for you. I cannot make a man's fortune twice." He contented himself with granting Patron a pension sufficient for his subsistence. Napoleon retained but a faint idea of Pichegru. He remembered that he was a tall man, rather red in the face. Pichegru, on the contrary, seems to have preserved a striking recollection of young Napoleon. When Pichegru joined the royalist party, he was asked whether it would not be possible to gain over the general-in-chief of the army of Italy. "To attempt that would only be wasting time," said he. "From my knowledge of him, when a boy, I am sure he must be the most inflexible character. He has formed his resolutions, and he will not change them." The emperor has often been much amused at the tales and anecdotes that are related of his boyhood in the numerous little publications to which he has given rise. He acknowledges scarcely any of them. There is one relative to his confirmation at the military school at Paris, which, however, he admitted to be true. It is as follows. The archbishop who confirmed him, manifesting his astonishment at the name of Napoleon, said he did not know of any such saint, and that there was no such name in the calendar. The boy quickly replied that that could be no rule, since there were an immense number of saints and only 365 days. Napoleon never observed his festival day until after the Concordat. His patron saint was a stranger to the French calendar, and even where his name is recorded, the date of his festival is a matter of uncertainty. The Pope, however, fixed it for the 15th of August, which was at once the emperor's birthday and the day of the signing of the Concordat. In 1783, Napoleon was one of the scholars who, at the usual competition at Brienne, were fixed upon to be sent to the military school at Paris to finish their education. The choice was made annually by an inspector who visited the 12 military schools. This office was filled by the Chevalier de Carvalho, a general officer and the author of a work on military tactics. He was also the tutor of the present King of Bavaria, who in his youth bore the title of Duke. The Dupont Carvalho was an amiable old man and well qualified to discharge the duty of inspector of the military schools. He was fond of the boys, played with them when they had finished their examinations, and permitted those who had acquitted themselves most to his satisfaction to dine with him at the table of the monks. He was particularly attached to young Napoleon and took a pleasure in stimulating him to exertion. He singled him out to be sent to Paris, though it would appear he had not at that time attained the requisite age. The lad was not very far advanced in any branch of education except mathematics, and the monks suggested that it would be better to wait till the following year to afford time for further improvement. But this the Chevalier de Carvalho would by no means agree to. "I know what I'm about," said he, "and if I am transgressing their rules, it is not on account of family influence. I know nothing of the friends of this youth. I am actuated only by my own opinion of his merit. I perceive in him a spark of genius, which cannot be too early fostered." The worthy Chevalier died suddenly, before he had time to carry his determination into effect, but his successor, M. de Regnault, who would not perhaps have evinced half his penetration, nevertheless fulfilled his decision, and young Napoleon was sent to Paris. At this period, he began to develop qualities of a superior order, decision of character, profound reflection, and vigorous conceptions. It would appear that from his earliest childhood, his parents rested all their hopes on him. His father, when on his deathbed at Montpellier, though Joseph was beside him, spoke only of Napoleon, who was then at the military school. In the delirium with which he was seized in his last moments, he incessantly called Napoleon to come to his aid with his great sword. The grand-uncle Lucien, who on his deathbed was surrounded by all his relatives, said, addressing himself to Joseph, "You are the eldest of the family, but there is the head of it," pointing to Napoleon. "Never lose sight of him." The emperor used to laugh and say, this was a true disinheritance. It was the scene of Jacob and Esau. Having myself been educated at the military school of Paris, though at an earlier period than at which Napoleon attended it, I was enabled to return from my emigration to converse about the emperor with the masters who had been common to us both. Monsieur de la Gueule, our teacher of history, used to boast that the records of the military school contained proofs of his having foretold the great career which his pupil was destined to fill, and that he had frequently in his notes eulogized the depth of his reflection and the shrewdness of his judgment. He informed me that the first consul used often to invite him to breakfast at Malmaison, and that he always took pleasure in conversing about his old lessons. "That which made the deepest impression on me," said he one day to Monsieur de Aiguille, "was the revolt of the Constable de Bourbon. Though you did not present it to us precisely in its proper light, you made it appear that his great crime was his having fought against his king, which certainly was but a trifling fault in those days of divided nobility and sovereignty, particularly considering the scandalous injustice of which he was the victim. His great, his real, his only crime, and that on which you did not sufficiently dwell, was his having joined with foreigners to attack his native country." Monsieur Duméron, our professor of belles-lettres, informed me that he had always been struck with the singularity of Napoleon's amplifications, which he said were like granite heated in a volcano. Only one individual formed a mistaken idea of him. That was Mr. Bauer, the dull, heavy German master. Young Napoleon never made much progress in the German language, which offended Monsieur Bauer, who ranked German above all things, and he, in consequence, formed a most contemptible opinion of his pupil's abilities. One day, Napoleon, not being in his place, Monsieur Bauer inquired where he was, and was told that he was attending his examination in the class of artillery. "What? Does he know anything?" said Mr. Bauer, ironically. "Why, sir, he is the best mathematician in the school," was the reply. "Ah, I have always heard it remarked, and I have always believed that none but a fool could learn mathematics." "It would be curious," said the emperor, "to know whether Mr. Bauer lived long enough to see me rise in the world and to enjoy the confirmation of his own judgment." Napoleon was scarcely 18 years of age when the Abbé Raynal, struck with the extent of his acquirements, appreciated his merit so highly as to make him one of the ornaments of his scientific déjeuner. Finally, the celebrated Paoli, who, after having long inspired Napoleon with a sort of veneration, found the latter at the head of a party against him the moment he showed himself favorable to the English, was accustomed to say, "This young man is formed on the ancient model." He is one of Plutarch's men. In 1785, Napoleon, who was created at once a cadet and the officer of artillery, quitted the military school to enter the regiment of La Fère in the rank of second lieutenant, whence he was promoted to the rank of first lieutenant in the regiment of Grenoble. Napoleon, on quitting the military school, went to join his regiment at Valence. The first winter he spent there, his comrades at the mess table were Lariboisière, whom during the Empire he appointed Inspector General of the Artillery, Serbier, who succeeded Lariboisière at that post, de Douville, Jr., afterwards Minister Plenipotentiary at Frankfurt. Maillet, the brother of him who headed the tumult in Paris in 1813, an officer named Mabille, whom, on his return from emigration, the emperor appointed to a situation in the post office. Roland de Villasceau, afterwards prefect of Nîmes. De Mazy, Jr., his companion at the military school and the friend of his early years, who, after Napoleon ascended the throne, became keeper of the imperial wardrobe. There were in the corps officers more or less easy in their circumstances. Napoleon ranked among the former. He received from his family 1,200 francs a year, which was then the amount of an officer's full pay. There were 2 individuals in the regiment who could afford to keep cabriolets or carriages of some kind, and they were looked upon as very great men. Sorbier was one of these 2. His companions got him to drive them about, and they repaid the obligation by jokes and puns. Sorbier was the son of a physician at Moulins. At Valence, Napoleon got an early introduction to Madame de Colombier, a lady about 50 years of age who was endowed with many rare and estimable qualities and who was the most distinguished person in the town. She entertained a great regard for the young artillery officer, and through her connection, he mingled with all the best company in Valence and its neighborhood. She introduced him to the Abbé de Saint-Ruf, an elderly man of property who was frequently visited by the most distinguished persons in the country. Napoleon was indebted for the favor he enjoyed to his extensive information, joined to the facility and force with which he turned it to account. Madame de Colombier often foretold that he would be a distinguished man. The death of this lady happened about the time of the breaking out of the Revolution. It was an event in which she took great interest, and in her last moments was heard to say that if no misfortune befell young Napoleon, he would infallibly play a distinguished part in the events of the time. The emperor never spoke of Madame de Colombier but with expressions of the tenderest gratitude, and he did not hesitate to acknowledge that the valuable introductions and superior company in society which she procured for him had great influence over his destiny. The gaiety which Napoleon enjoyed at this period of his life excited great jealousy on the part of his fellow officers. They were displeased at seeing him absent himself so frequently from among them, though his doing so could be no reasonable ground of offense to them. Fortunately, the commandant, Monsieur Durtuby, have formed a just estimate of his character. He showed him great kindness and afforded him the means of fulfilling his military duties, and at the same time of mingling in the pleasures of society. Napoleon conceived an attachment for Mademoiselle de Colombier, who on her part was not insensible to his merits. It was the first love of both, and it was that kind of love which might be expected to arise at their age and with their education. We were the most innocent creatures imaginable, the emperor used to say. We contrived little meetings together. I well remember one which took place on a midsummer morning, just as daylight began to dawn. It will scarcely be believed that all our happiness consisted in eating cherries together. It has been said that the mother wished to bring about this marriage, and that the father opposed it on the ground that they would ruin each other by their union, while each was separately destined to a fortunate career. But this story is untrue, as it is likewise another anecdote relative to the marriage with Mademoiselle Clary, afterwards Madame Bernadotte, now Queen of Sweden. In 1805, the emperor, when about to be crowned king of Italy, on passing through Lyon, again saw Mademoiselle de Colombier, who had now changed her name to Madame de Bracieux. She gained access to him with some difficulty, surrounded as he was by the etiquette of royalty. Napoleon was happy to see her again, but he found her much altered for the worse. He did for her husband what she solicited, and placed her in the situation of lady of honor to one of his sisters. Mademoiselle de Laurencin and Saint-Germain were at that time the reigning toasts in Valence, where they divided the general admiration. The latter married Monsieur de Montalivet, who was also known to the emperor at that time, and who was afterwards made minister of the interior. He was an honest fellow, said Napoleon, and one who, I believe, remained firmly attached to me. When about 18 or 20 years of age, the emperor was distinguished as a young man of extensive information, possessing a reflective turn of mind and strong reasoning powers. His reading had been very extensive, and he had profoundly meditated on the fund of knowledge thus acquired, much of which, he used to say, he had probably since lost. His sparkling and ready wit and energetic language distinguished him wherever he went. He was a favorite with everyone, particularly the fair sex, to whom he recommended himself by the elegance and novelty of his ideas and the boldness of his arguments. As for the men, they were often afraid to engage with him in those discussions into which he was led by a natural confidence in his own powers. Many individuals who knew him at an early period of life predicted his extraordinary career, and they viewed the events of his life without astonishment. At an early age, he gained anonymously a prize at the Academy of Lyon on the following question proposed by Raynal: what other principles and institutions calculated to advance mankind to the highest possible degree of happiness? The anonymous memorial excited great attention. It was perfectly in unison with the ideas of the age. It began by inquiring in what happiness consisted, and the answer was in the most perfect enjoyment of life, in the manner most conformable with our moral and physical organization. After he became emperor, Napoleon was one day conversing on the subject with Mr. de Talleyrand. The latter, like a skillful courtier, shortly after presented to him the famous Memoirs which he had procured from the archives of the Academy of Lyon. The emperor took it, and after reading a few pages, threw it into the fire, this first production of his youth. "We can never think of everything," said Napoleon, and M. de Talleyrand had not taken the precaution of having it copied. The Prince de Condé one day visited the artillery school of Auxonne, and the cadets considered it a high honor to be examined by that military prince. The commandant, in spite of the hierarchy, placed young Napoleon at the head of the polygon in preference to others of superior rank. It happened that on the day preceding the examination, all the cannons of the polygon were spiked, but Napoleon was too much on the alert to be caught by this trick of comrades, or snare, perhaps, of the illustrious traveler. It is generally believed that Napoleon in his boyhood was taciturn, sullen, and morose. On the contrary, he was of a lively turn. He never appeared more delighted than when relating to us the various tricks he was accustomed to play when at the school of artillery. In describing the joyous moments of his early youth, he seemed to forget the misfortunes which hold him in captivity. There was an old commandant, upwards of 80 years of age, for whom the cadets entertained a very high respect, notwithstanding the many jokes they played upon him. One day, while he was examining them in their cannon exercise and watching every discharge with his eyeglass, he asserted that they were far from hitting the mark, and asked those near him if they had seen the ball strike. Nobody had observed the youths slipping aside the ball every time they loaded. The old general was rather sharp. After 5 or 6 discharges, he took it into his head to count the balls. The trick was discovered. The general thought it a very good one, but nevertheless ordered all who had participated in it to be put under arrest. The cadets would occasionally take a peek at some of their captains, or determined to revenge themselves on others to whom they owed a grudge. They then resolved to banish them from society and to reduce them to the necessity of putting themselves under a sort of arrest. 4 or 5 of the cadets undertook to execute the design. They fastened on to their victim, pursued him into every company, and he was not suffered to open his mouth without being methodically and logically contradicted, though always with a strict regard to politeness. At length, the poor fellow found that retirement was his only alternative. On another occasion, Napoleon used to relate, one of my comrades who lodged above me unluckily took a fancy to learn to play the horn, and made such a hideous noise as completely disturbed the studies of those who were within hearing. We met each other one day on the stairs. "Are you not tired of practicing the horn?" said I. "Not at all," he replied. "At any rate, you tire other people." "I am sorry for it. It would be better if you went to practice elsewhere." "I am master of my own apartment." "Perhaps you may be taught to entertain a doubt on that point." "I scarce think anyone will be bold enough to attempt to teach me that." A challenge ensued, but before the antagonists met, the affair was submitted to the consideration of a council of the cadets, and it was determined that one should practice the horn at a greater distance, and that the other should be more accommodating. In the campaign of 1814, the emperor again met his horn player in the neighborhood of Soissons or Lyon. He was residing on his estate and gave some important information respecting the enemy's position. The emperor made him one of his aides-de-camp. This officer was called Colonel Bussy. When attached to his artillery regiment, Napoleon seized every opportunity of mingling in company, where he invariably made an agreeable impression. Women at that time attached a high value to wit in the other sex. It was a quality which never failed to win their good graces. Napoleon at this period performed what he termed his sentimental journey from Valence to Monsigny in Burgundy, and he intended to write an account of it after the manner of Sterne. The faithful Desmazis was of the party. He was constantly with him, and his narrative of Napoleon's private life, if combined with the details of his public career, would form a perfect history of the emperor. It would then be seen that however extraordinary his life might be with respect to its incidents, Yet nothing could be more simple or natural than its course. Circumstances and reflection have considerably modified his character. Even his style of expression, now so concise and laconic, was in his youth diffuse and emphatic. At the time of the Legislative Assembly, Napoleon assumed a serious and severe demeanor and became less communicative than before. The Army of Italy also marked another epoch in his character, his extreme youth. When he went to take the command of the army, rendered it necessary that he should evince great reserve and the utmost strictness of morals. This was indispensably necessary, said he, to enable me to command men so much above me in point of age. I pursued a line of conduct truly irreproachable and exemplary. I proved myself a sort of Cato. I must have appeared such in the eyes of all. I was a philosopher and a sage. In this character, he appeared on the theater of the world. Napoleon was in garrison at Valence when the revolution broke out. At that time, it was made a point of particular importance to induce the artillery officers to emigrate. And the officers, on their part, were very much divided on opinion. Napoleon, who was thoroughly imbued with the notions of the age, possessing a natural instinct for great actions and a passion for national glory, espoused the cause of the revolution, and his example influenced the majority of the regiment. He was an ardent patriot under the Constituent Assembly. But the Legislative Assembly marked a new period in his ideas and opinions. He was at Paris on the 21st of June, 1792, and witnessed the insurrection of the people of the Faubourgs, who traversed the garden of the Tuileries and forced the palace. There were but 6,000 men, a mere disorderly mob, whose language and dress proved them to belong to the very lowest class of society. Napoleon was also a witness of the events of the 10th of August, in which the assailants were neither higher in rank nor more formidable in number. In 1793, Napoleon was in Corsica, where he had a command of the National Guards. He opposed Paoli as soon as he was led to suspect that the veterans, to whom he had hitherto been so much attached, entertained the design of betraying the island to the English. Therefore, it is not true, as has been generally reported, that Napoleon or one of his family was at one time in England proposing to raise a Corsican regiment for the English service. The English and Paoli subdued the Corsican patriots. At Ajaccio, the house of the Bonapartes was destroyed in the general conflagration, and the family was obliged to fly to the continent. They fixed their abode at Marseille, whence Napoleon proceeded to Paris. He arrived just at the moment when the Federalists of Marseille had surrendered Toulon to the English. September 1st through 6th. On the 1st of September, we found from our latitude that we should see the Cape Verde Islands. In the course of the day, the sky was, however, overcast, and at night we could see nothing. The admiral, convinced that there was a mistake in the reckoning of our longitude, was preparing to bear westward to the right in order to fall in with the islands, when a brig, which was ahead of us, intimated by a signal that she had discovered them on the left. During the night, the wind blew violently from the southeast, and if our mistake had been the reverse of what it was, and the admiral had really borne to the right, it is not probable that we should have been thrown out of our course, a proof that notwithstanding the improvements in science, mistakes are very apt to take place, and that the chances of navigation are very great. As the wind continued to blow strong and the sea was boisterous, the admiral preferred continuing his course rather than waiting to take in water, of which he believed he had already a sufficient store. Everything now promised a prosperous passage. We were already very far advanced on our course. Every circumstance continued favorable. The weather was mild, and we might even have thought our voyage agreeable, had it been undertaken in the pursuit of our own plans and in conformity with our own inclinations. But how could we forget our past misfortunes or close our eyes to the future? Occupation alone could enable us to support the languor and tedium of our days. I had undertaken to teach my son English, and the emperor, to whom I mentioned the progress he was making, expressed a wish to learn also. I endeavored to form a very simple plan for his instruction in order to save him trouble. This did very well for 2 or 3 days, but the ennui occasioned by the study was at least equal to that which it was intended to counteract, and the English was laid aside. The emperor occasionally reproached me with having discontinued my lessons. I replied that I had the medicine ready, if he had the courage to take it. In other respects, particularly before the English, his manners and habits were always the same. Never did a murmur or a wish escape his lips. He invariably appeared contented, patient, and good-humored. The admiral, who, on account of our reputation, I suppose, had assumed great stiffness on our departure from England, gradually laid aside his reserve, and every day took greater interest in his captive. He represented the danger incurred by coming on deck after dinner, owing to the damp of the evening. The emperor would then sometimes take his arm and prolong the conversation, which never failed to gratify him exceedingly. I've been assured that the admiral carefully noted down every particular that he could collect. If this be true, the remarks which the emperor one day made during dinner on naval affairs, on the French resources in the south, those which he had already created, and those which he contemplated, and on the ports and harbors of the Mediterranean, to all of which the admiral listened with deep attention, and, as if fearful of interruption, will compose a chapter truly valuable to a seaman. I will now return to the details collected during our ordinary conversation. The following relate to the siege of Toulon. In September 1793, Napoleon Bonaparte, then in his 24th year, was yet unknown to the world, which was destined to resound with his name. He was a lieutenant colonel of artillery and had only a few weeks in Paris, having left Corsica, where political events had forced him to yield to the faction of Paoli. The English had taken possession of Toulon. An experienced artillery officer was wanting to direct the operations of the siege, and Napoleon was fixed on. There will history take him up, never more to leave him. There commences his immortality. I refer to the Memoirs of the campaign of Italy for the plan of attack which he adopted, and the manner in which that plan was carried into effect. It will there be seen that it was he, and he alone, who took the fortress. This was a great triumph, no doubt, but to appreciate it justly, it would be necessary to compare the plan of the attack with the account of the evacuation. The one is the literal prediction, and the other is the fulfillment, word for word. From this moment, the young commander of artillery enjoyed the highest reputation. The emperor never looks back to this period without pleasure, and always mentions it as the happiest portion of his life. The taking of Toulon was his first successful achievement, and it naturally excites the fondest recollections. The history of the campaign of Italy will present a faithful picture of the three generals-in-chief who succeeded each other during the siege: the inconceivable ignorance of Cartel, the gloomy brutality of Dopé, and the honest courage of Dugommier. Of them I shall here say nothing. At the first breaking out of the revolution, there was nothing but disorder in the material and ignorance in the personnel of the French army, which was owing both to the confusion of the times and the rapidity and irregularity with which the promotions had been made. The following story will afford an idea to the state of affairs and of the manners of the time. On his arrival at headquarters, Napoleon waited on General Cartel, a grand figure covered with gold lace from head to foot, who asked him what duty he had been set upon. The young officer modestly presented the letter which directed him to superintend, under the general's command, the operations of the artillery. "This is quite unnecessary," said the fine-looking man, twirling his whiskers. "We want no assistance to retake Toulon, but however, you are welcome, and you may share the glory of burning the town tomorrow without having experienced any of the fatigue." And he made him stay to sup with him.